The Vanishing at Pinewood Lake, a Detective Shernan cold case investigation. Content warning. This video contains descriptions of violent crime, psychological distress, and content that may be disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. This content is only suitable for viewers 18 years and older. Legal disclaimer: all names, specific locations, and identifying details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. While this case is based on real events, certain elements have been altered for investigative integrity and legal purposes. This presentation is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered a complete account of legal proceedings. Introduction. I've always believed that the dead speak to us, not through supernatural whispers or ghostly apparitions, but through the evidence they leave behind. The final chapter of their story, written in blood, fibers, and the invisible traces that most people never notice. My name is Detective Shernan, and for the past 23 years, I've dedicated my life to listening to those who can no longer speak for themselves, the victims of unsolved crimes. The case I'm about to share with you has haunted me for over a decade. It's one of those investigations that burrows under your skin, takes root in your thoughts, and refuses to let go. Even now, as I tell you this story, I can feel the weight of unresolved questions pressing down on me like the heavy mist that blanketed Pinewood Lake that fateful October morning. October 17th, 2011. While most of America was preparing for Halloween festivities, a small lakeside community in rural Minnesota became the setting for a nightmare that would leave a family shattered, a town paralyzed with fear, and a detective menacing the most perplexing case of his career. This is the story of Sarah Winters, a 28-year-old elementary school teacher whose disappearance defied logical explanation. A woman who vanished from a locked cabin while 5 other people slept under the same roof. A woman whose case would lead me through a labyrinth of false leads, buried secrets, and psychological manipulation that would challenge everything I thought I knew about human nature. What makes this case exceptional isn't just its bizarre circumstances, but how close we came to solving it before everything we thought we knew crumbled beneath our feet. The evidence was there, the suspects were there, even the motive seemed clear. Until it wasn't. I've reopened the case files to share this story with you now because I believe someone watching might hold the missing piece. After all this time, Sarah deserves justice, and her family deserves closure. As we journey through this investigation together, I want you to imagine yourself in my shoes processing the crime scene, interrogating the witnesses, connecting the dots that at first seemed completely unrelated. What would you notice that I missed? What questions would you ask? Because in my experience, it's often the questions we fail to ask that lead to the truth. Turn down your lights and silence your phone. We're about to enter the dark, twisted world of a case that defies conventional explanation, a case where the truth is more disturbing than anything you could imagine. The setting Pinewood Lake isn't on most maps. It's one of those secluded retreats where wealthy families from Minneapolis and St. Paul maintain vacation properties they visit a few weekends each year. In October, most cabins stand empty, with only a handful of year-round residents braving Minnesota's approaching winter. The Winters family cabin sat on the northeastern shore, partially hidden by towering pine trees that had stood sentinel for over a century. 3 bedrooms, a large open-concept living area, and a wraparound deck with a view of the lake that would make real estate agents salivate. From the outside, it looked like the perfect retreat from the pressures of urban life. I remember the first time I drove up that winding gravel driveway, oak leaves crunching under my tires, the smell of pine and lake water hanging in the crisp autumn air. I had no idea that this picturesque setting would become the backdrop for one of the most baffling disappearances of my career. "You've got to understand the isolation," I told my partner, Detective Rivera, as we approached the cabin. "The nearest neighbor is half a mile away. The closest town is 20 minutes by car. If someone screamed out here, there'd be no one to hear it except the loons on the lake." The 5 people who had spent the night in the cabin stood huddled on the deck, breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. None of them made eye contact as we approached. Each was wrapped in a blanket provided by the first responders, though I suspected their shivering had little to do with the temperature. What kind of person vanishes from a locked house? Rivera murmured as we approached. "That's what we're here to find out," I replied. But I was already asking myself a different question. What kind of people were inside that house when she disappeared? The witnesses. Before I take you through the evidence, you need to know the players in this drama. Each of these 5 individuals was present in the cabin the night Sarah vanished. Each had a connection to her, and each, as I would discover, had secrets they desperately wanted to keep hidden. First, there was Michael Winters, Sarah's older brother and owner of the cabin. 34 years old, successful investment banker from Minneapolis, divorced with no children. Michael had organized the weekend getaway, describing it as a chance to reconnect with family and friends before the holidays. His calm demeanor initially impressed me until I realized it wasn't calm but emotional detachment, a defense mechanism or something more concerning. I wasn't sure yet. Rebecca Collins, Michael's new girlfriend of 6 months. 30 years old, pharmaceutical sales representative, polished and poised. She'd never met Sarah before that weekend, but insisted she'd been looking forward to getting to know Michael's family. Rebecca maintained she'd slept through the night and heard nothing unusual, a claim that would later come into question. David Winters, Sarah, and Michael's father. 62, retired school principal, widowed 3 years earlier when his wife, Eleanor, died of cancer. The family cabin had been Eleanor's pride and joy, and David had rarely visited since her death. According to his statement, this weekend was supposed to be about healing old wounds. Whose wounds he meant remained unclear. Lily Chen, Sarah's best friend since college. 28, pediatric nurse, married but attending alone as her husband had a work commitment. Lily was the last person to see Sarah before she went to bed around midnight. She seemed fine, Lily insisted during preliminary questioning. Tired, maybe a little quiet, but fine. The tremor in her voice suggested she was replaying that final conversation, searching for warning signs she might have missed. Finally, there was James Blackwood, Michael's college roommate and business partner. 35, unmarried, with the kind of charm that immediately puts people at ease. James claimed he barely knew Sarah, having only met her a handful of times at family events. Yet witness statements suggested he and Sarah had spent considerable time in conversation during dinner that evening, discrepancy that caught my attention immediately. 5 people, 5 different relationships to the victim, 5 different accounts of what happened that night. As I stood in that cabin on the first day, I couldn't help wondering, was I looking at 4 witnesses and 1 perpetrator, or was something far more complex at play? Have you ever been in a situation where you felt everyone was hiding something from you? Where every smile seemed forced, every answer carefully constructed? That's what it felt like interviewing these 5 individuals. And as the investigation progressed, that feeling only intensified. The timeline. Let me take you through the timeline as we initially understood it. Pay close attention because what people claimed happened and what actually occurred that night may be very different things. Friday, October 16, 2011, 3:0 p.m. Michael and Rebecca arrive first at the cabin, bringing groceries and alcohol for the weekend. 4:15 p.m. David arrives, having driven directly from his home in St. Cloud. 5:30 p.m. Sarah arrives alone, having taken a half day from her teaching job. 6:45 p.m. Lily arrives, later than expected due to traffic leaving Minneapolis. 7:30 p.m. James arrives last, explaining his delay was due to wrapping up some business matters. 8:00 p.m. 10:30 p.m. The group has dinner, drinks wine, and plays board games in the main living area. Multiple witnesses describe the atmosphere as relaxed and pleasant, though David notes that Sarah seemed preoccupied. 10:30 p.m. James and Michael moved to the deck to smoke cigars and continue drinking whiskey. The three women and David remain inside. 11:15 p.m. David goes to bed in the master bedroom. He takes a prescription sleep aid, which he says would have made it impossible for him to hear anything during the night. 11:30 p.m. Rebecca also retires to the bedroom she's sharing with Michael. 11:45 p.m. James comes inside from the deck and goes to the guest room he's using. Midnight. Sarah and Lily, who are sharing the third bedroom with twin beds, finally go to their room. Lily later states that they talked for about 15 minutes before turning out the lights. 12:15 a.m. Michael comes in from the deck, checks that all doors and windows are locked, a habit he attributes to city living, and joins Rebecca in their bedroom. Saturday, October 17, 2011, 7:30 a.m. Lily wakes and notices Sarah's bed is empty. Assuming she got up early, Lily goes to the bathroom, then checks the main living area. 7:45 a.m. Unable to find Sarah anywhere in the cabin, Lily wakes Michael. A search of the property begins. 8:15 a.m. After confirming Sarah is nowhere on the property and her car is still in the driveway, Michael calls 911 to report her missing. 9:05 a.m. First responders arrive and secure the scene. 10:20 a.m. Detective Rivera and I arrive to begin our investigation. In those first critical hours, certain facts immediately stood out to me. First, all doors and windows were locked from the inside, with no signs of forced entry. Sarah's purse, phone, and car keys were still on the nightstand in her bedroom. Her jacket hung on the hook by the front door. Her car remained in the driveway. If she had left voluntarily, she did so without any belongings, without transportation, in the middle of the night when temperatures dipped into the low 40s. The second troubling detail: no one heard anything. 5 people in a wooden cabin with creaky floors, and not one person heard movement during the night. Is it possible she went for a walk and got lost? Rivera suggested as we surveyed the dense woods surrounding the property. I remember looking out at Pinewood Lake, its surface rippling in the morning breeze, without a jacket, without her phone, in near freezing temperatures. And if she did, how did she get out of a locked house without anyone hearing her? Those questions would be just the beginning of the rabbit hole this case would become. Ask yourself, what would compel a woman to leave the safety of a cabin in the middle of a cold October night? Or did she leave at all? Could Sarah still have been in that cabin when we arrived, hidden somewhere we hadn't thought to look? These questions would haunt me in the days to come. The investigation begins. The first 48 hours of any missing persons investigation are critical. With each passing hour, the chances of finding the missing person alive diminish dramatically. I knew we couldn't afford to overlook any detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Our first order of business was processing the scene. The cabin revealed initially no signs of struggle, no blood or evidence of violence. Sarah's bed had been slept in, the covers were pulled back, and her phone showed it had been plugged in to charge overnight. Her clothing from the previous day was neatly folded on a chair. It's as if she vanished into thin air, Rivera remarked as we examined the bedroom. Nobody vanishes, I replied, examining the floorboards carefully. People leave traces. We just haven't found them yet. We brought in cadaver dogs to search the property and the surrounding woods. They found nothing. We dragged portions of the lake closest to the cabin. Nothing. We interviewed the few year-round residents and weekend visitors in neighboring cabins. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. Meanwhile, we conducted separate in-depth interviews with each of our 5 witnesses. This is where things began to get interesting, and contradictions in their accounts started to emerge. Michael, whose initial calmness had struck me as odd, became visibly agitated when questioned about his relationship with his sister. Sarah and I have always been close, he insisted, his fingers drumming incessantly on the table. Sure, we've had disagreements like any siblings, but nothing serious. Yet when I spoke with David, their father, he painted a different picture. The kids haven't really gotten along since Eleanor died, he admitted, his voice heavy with grief even 3 years after his wife's passing. Sarah felt Michael abandoned the family during the worst of Eleanor's illness, focusing on his career instead. And Michael resented that Sarah was always Eleanor's favorite. David paused, then added, "But that's just family stuff. It doesn't mean anything now." But in my experience, family stuff often means everything in cases like this. Lily, Sarah's supposed best friend, was equally revealing in what she didn't say. When asked about Sarah's romantic life, Lily hesitated noticeably before answering. "Sarah wasn't seeing anyone special that I knew of," she finally offered. "That you knew of," I repeated. "Was there someone she might not have told you about?" Lily's eyes darted to the window before she answered. Sarah was a private person in some ways. "It's possible, I suppose." When we asked if Sarah had seemed worried or afraid recently, Lily again paused too long before denying it. Her body language screamed deception-crossed arms, minimal eye contact, frequent touching of her face and neck. "Lily," I said gently, "Sarah is missing. If there's anything at all that might help us find her, now is the time to tell us." Tears filled her eyes. She'd been receiving texts, she finally admitted, messages that scared her. She wouldn't show them to me, just said someone was watching her. I thought she was being paranoid, maybe stressed from work. Her voice broke. I should have taken her more seriously. This was our first real lead. We immediately requested Sarah's phone records, but her phone found in her room had been wiped clean of all messages and call history sometime between midnight and when she was discovered missing. Someone had deliberately deleted potential evidence. The question was, had Sarah done it herself, or had someone else accessed her phone after she disappeared? James Blackwood, Michael's friend, provided another crucial piece of information, though I suspect he didn't realize its significance at the time. Sarah mentioned she'd found some old family letters in the cabin, he told us. Said they'd changed how she saw her parents' marriage. I got the impression she was planning to confront her father about them, but I don't know if she ever did. When questioned about these letters, David became visibly uncomfortable. "Eleanor kept a lot of correspondence," he said dismissively. "Sarah was always overly romantic about the past. Whatever she found, I'm sure it was nothing important, but his discomfort suggested otherwise. What were in those letters? And more importantly, where were they now?" Despite a thorough search, we never found any letters in the cabin. Rebecca, Michael's girlfriend, was perhaps the most interesting interview of all. Initially, she maintained she'd gone to bed early and slept through the night. But when pressed about her relationship with Sarah, cracks appeared in her poised facade. "I barely knew her," Rebecca insisted. "We met for the first time at dinner that night." "And how would you describe your impression of her?" I asked. Rebecca's perfectly manicured nails tapped against her water bottle. She seemed nice, quiet, maybe a little judgmental. "Judgmental?" I prompted. She kept asking about my relationship with Michael. How we met, how serious we were. It felt like an interrogation rather than getting to know each other. Rebecca's voice hardened slightly. I think she was protective of her brother, or maybe just didn't think I was good enough for him. I would later discover that Rebecca had lied about never meeting Sarah before. A co-worker of Sarah's came forward stating that Sarah had mentioned meeting Rebecca at a restaurant in Minneapolis a month earlier, a meeting that apparently left Sarah deeply troubled. By the end of those first 48 hours, instead of answers, we had only accumulated more questions. 5 witnesses with inconsistent stories. A missing woman who had vanished from a locked cabin without taking any belongings. Mysterious texts that had been deleted. Family letters that had disappeared along with Sarah, and underlying it all, tensions and secrets that no one seemed willing to fully disclose. If you were investigating this case, what would your instincts tell you at this point? Would you suspect an intruder somehow managed to enter and leave a locked cabin without leaving evidence? Or would you be looking more closely at the 5 people who were supposedly sleeping under the same roof when Sarah vanished? For me, the answer was becoming increasingly clear. The key to Sarah's disappearance lay not in the surrounding woods or the cold depths of Pinewood Lake, but within the walls of that cabin and in the complicated relationships of those who had spent the night there. The evidence. As the investigation progressed beyond those initial interviews, we began to uncover physical evidence that painted an even more troubling picture. First, there was the matter of Sarah's footprints. October in Minnesota means dew-covered grass in the mornings, and our crime scene technicians found a single trail of footprints leading from the cabin's back door toward the lake. The prints matched Sarah's shoe size and the pattern of her running shoes, which were notably missing from the collection of footwear by the door. But here's where it gets strange. The footprints stopped abruptly about 20 yards from the shoreline. Not at the water's edge, as you might expect if someone had entered the lake, but in the middle of a clearing. It was as if Sarah had simply vanished or been lifted off the ground at that point. Could someone have carried her from here? Rivera suggested as we stood at the end of the footprint trail. I surveyed the ground carefully. If they did, they were careful not to leave their own prints. No signs of dragging either. We brought in ground-penetrating radar to check for recently disturbed soil in the vicinity. Nothing. The lake was searched again, more thoroughly this time. Again, nothing. Second, there was blood, evidence minimal, but present. Luminol testing revealed a small amount of blood on the kitchen floor that had been carefully cleaned up. DNA testing would later confirm it was Sarah's. Not enough blood to suggest a fatal injury, but enough to indicate she had been hurt in some way. When confronted with this evidence, all 5 witnesses expressed shock and denied any knowledge of how Sarah's blood came to be on the kitchen floor. She might have cut herself making dinner, Michael suggested. She was chopping vegetables for the salad. But our interview with Lily had established that Rebecca, not Sarah, had prepared the salad that evening. Third, there was the matter of the cabin's security system. Michael had installed a simple system that chimed whenever a door or window was opened. The system's memory log showed that the back door had been opened at 2:17 a.m. and again at 3:04 a.m. This contradicted Michael's claim that all doors had remained locked throughout the night. When presented with this evidence, Michael appeared genuinely confused. "That's impossible," he insisted. "I checked everything before I went to bed. And I would have heard the chime if someone opened a door during the night. Unless you were the one who opened it," I suggested. His face hardened. "I was asleep next to Rebecca. She'll confirm that." Rebecca did indeed confirm Michael had been in bed with her all night, but something about her statement troubled me. There was a rehearsed quality to it, as if she'd anticipated the question and prepared her answer. Fourth, there were the mysterious letters James had mentioned. While we never found them in the cabin, we did discover something potentially related. A torn photograph in the fireplace, partially burned but recoverable. It showed a younger Eleanor Winters standing beside a man who was not David. They were holding hands, looking at each other with unmistakable intimacy. When shown this photograph, David's face went ashen. "Where did you find this?" he demanded, his voice barely audible. "I think you know it was in the fireplace," I replied. "The question is, who put it there, and why try to destroy it?" David refused to identify the man in the photo or explain its significance. But his reaction told me we'd stumbled onto something important, something that might relate to the family letters Sarah had discovered. Finally, there was perhaps the most disturbing evidence of all, Sarah's journal, which we found hidden beneath the mattress in her bedroom. The most recent entry, dated the day before her disappearance, read, "I can't believe what I've discovered. If it's true, everything I thought I knew about our family is a lie. I need to confront Dad tomorrow, but I'm afraid of how M will react if he finds out. He's already under so much pressure with the business situation. This could push him over the edge. But I can't keep this secret anymore. Too much damage has already been done." What family secret had Sarah uncovered? What business situation was putting pressure on Michael? And why was Sarah afraid of her brother's reaction? I remember standing in that cabin after a week of investigation, surrounded by evidence that pointed in multiple directions, yet somehow failed to create a coherent picture. Like pieces from different puzzles mixed together, nothing quite fit. But one thing had become abundantly clear. Sarah Winters hadn't simply wandered off into the night. Something or someone in that cabin had put her in danger. Have you ever had that feeling when you're putting together a jigsaw puzzle, that you're missing a crucial piece, the one that would make the whole picture make sense? That's where I was with the Winters case. I had evidence, I had witnesses, I had motives, but I couldn't see how it all connected. Not yet, anyway. The mid-story climax. 8 days into the investigation, everything changed. What happened that day would alter the course of the investigation and force me to question everything I thought I knew about the case. It began with a phone call at 3:17 a.m. I remember the time precisely because I'd just checked my watch, wondering how many more hours I could go without sleep. The Winters case had consumed me, and insomnia had become my constant companion. The caller was Officer Jensen from the local police department. "Detective Shernan," he said, his voice tense. "We've got a situation at Pinewood Lake. A woman just walked into the gas station on Highway 10. She's soaking wet, disoriented, and claiming to be Sarah Winters." I was in my car before he finished speaking. The gas station was a 24-hour place about 5 miles from the Winters cabin, only business open in the area at that hour. When I arrived, Sarah Winters was sitting in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in blankets, a vacant look in her eyes. Her hair was wet, her skin pale and pruned as if she'd been in water for an extended period. She wore what appeared to be the same pajamas she'd disappeared in, now soiled and torn. "Sarah," I said gently, approaching slowly to avoid startling her. "I'm Detective Shernan. Do you remember me? I've been looking for you." Her eyes focused on me briefly, then drifted away. "The lake," she murmured. "I was in the lake. All this time, in the lake." The paramedics informed me she was suffering from severe hypothermia, exhaustion, and possible traumatic shock. Given the near-freezing temperatures of Pinewood Lake in October, it seemed medically impossible that she could have survived submersion for 8 days. "We need to get her to a hospital," the paramedic insisted. "You can question her later." I nodded, but before they closed the ambulance doors, I asked one more question. "Sarah, who did this to you? Who put you in the lake?" Her eyes, which had been unfocused, suddenly locked onto mine with startling clarity. "He did," she whispered. "The man who isn't my father." The ambulance doors closed, and she was rushed to the regional medical center. I stood in the gas station parking lot, her words echoing in my mind. The man who isn't my father. Was she referring to David? To the man in the partially burned photograph? Or in her disoriented state, was she speaking metaphorically or even deliriously? I called Rivera immediately. "Meet me at the hospital," I told him. "Sarah's alive." What followed was a day of stunning revelations and even more baffling questions. Sarah was placed in the ICU where doctors confirmed she was suffering from hypothermia, malnourishment, and various cuts and bruises. But their medical assessment raised more questions than it answered. "Her condition is inconsistent with continuous water submersion for 8 days, the attending physician explained. She would have died of hypothermia within hours in water that cold. And there's evidence some of her injuries are more recent within the last 24 to 48 hours. This suggested Sarah had not been in the lake for the entire 8 days she was missing. But if not, where had she been? And how had no one found her during our extensive searches? When Sarah regained enough strength to speak coherently, her account of what happened that night shattered our entire understanding of the case. "I woke up around 2 a.m., she told us, her voice weak but determined. I heard voices in the kitchen arguing. I recognized Michael and James. They were fighting about money, lots of money. James kept saying they were going to lose everything if they didn't take care of the problem. Sarah explained that she'd slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Lily, and crept down the hallway to listen. That's when I heard my name. James said, "Sarah knows too much. She's found the letters. If she connects them to the company accounts, we're finished." Michael said he'd talk to me, convinced me to keep quiet, but James wasn't having it. He said, "Your sister's a liability we can't afford." Sarah described how she'd tried to retreat to her room, but the floorboard creaked. James had discovered her eavesdropping. There was a confrontation in the kitchen. Sarah couldn't remember all the details, but she recalled being struck and falling, which would explain the blood we found. "The next thing I clearly remember is being in the trunk of a car," she continued. "When it stopped, James opened it. We were at some cabin I didn't recognize, farther up the lake. He had a boat. He took me out in it, far from shore. He had something heavy tied to my ankles. He was going to drown me." Here, Sarah's account became fragmented. She described a struggle on the boat, managing to free herself and falling into the lake. She claimed she'd stayed hidden along the heavily wooded shoreline for days, delirious and injured, afraid to seek help because she believed James was searching for her. "I kept moving at night, sleeping hidden during the day," she said. "I was trying to find my way back to civilization without using the roads. But I got so cold, so hungry. I don't remember much of the last few days until I saw the lights of the gas station." Her story was compelling, emotional, and detailed, the kind of account that would convince most investigators. But there was a problem, a big problem. James Blackwood had an airtight alibi for the night Sarah disappeared and the days that followed. After leaving the Winters cabin on Sunday morning, he had flown to Chicago for a banking conference. Hotel security footage, conference attendance records, and numerous witnesses confirmed his presence in Chicago from Sunday afternoon through Wednesday evening. He couldn't possibly have attacked Sarah, driven her to another cabin, or taken her out in a boat knot unless he had an accomplice. When I gently pointed out this inconsistency to Sarah, her reaction was disturbing. She became agitated, insisting that it was definitely James who attacked her. When I pressed further about the timeline discrepancy, she began to cry, then abruptly claimed she was too tired to continue and needed to rest. As Rivera and I left the hospital that evening, we were more confused than ever. "She's lying," Rivera stated flatly as we walked to the parking lot. "The question is, why, and about which parts?" I wasn't ready to dismiss Sarah's entire account. People who experience trauma often have confused memories. She could be mixing up details, faces, or, Rivera suggested, she disappeared voluntarily for some reason, and now she's constructing a story to explain Aite's story that points the finger at someone who conveniently has an alibi, so it can't be disproven. But that theory didn't account for the blood in the kitchen or the security system log showing the door opening in the middle of the night. Something had happened in that cabin, something violent enough to leave blood that someone had attempted to clean up. As we drove back to the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still missing something fundamental about this case. Sarah's reappearance should have been the breakthrough we needed, but instead it had only deepened the mystery. Think about it. What would make a victim identify the wrong perpetrator so adamantly? Was it simply trauma-induced confusion? Or was Sarah protecting someone? And if James wasn't her attacker, who was? Michael? Rebecca? Her own father? Or was it someone we hadn't even considered yet? The Winters case had just entered its most perplexing phase, and I had the unsettling feeling that Sarah's return wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a darker, more twisted chapter. The unraveling with Sarah alive but her account questionable, we returned to the original evidence with fresh eyes. If James couldn't have attacked her due to his alibi, who did? And why would Sarah deliberately accuse someone who could easily prove his innocence? I decided to dig deeper into the family letters and business situation mentioned in Sarah's journal. This led us to subpoena the financial records of Blackwood Winters Investment Group, the firm Michael and James had founded together 5 years earlier. What we discovered was illuminating. The company was on the verge of collapse, having lost several major clients in the months preceding Sarah's disappearance. More troubling, there were indications of financial impropriety client funds that had been moved into offshore accounts, then seemingly vanished. When interviewed by financial crime specialists, several former clients mentioned receiving investment advice from a senior partner's daughter who worked in their research department. Sarah Winters had never officially worked for Blackwood Winters. She was an elementary school teacher. So who was this woman presenting herself as Michael's sister? The answer came from an unexpected source, Rebecca Collins. When confronted with the financial discrepancies in client statements, Rebecca finally broke down. "It was me," she admitted. "I'm not really a pharmaceutical rep. I worked with Michael and James. When clients needed reassurance, I'd sometimes pose as Michael's sister. It created a sense of family trustworthiness. Most clients never met the real Sarah. This was our first real breakthrough." Rebecca had been lying about her identity and relationship to the firm. But how did this connect to Sarah's disappearance? Rebecca continued, "About 2 months ago, Sarah found out what I was doing. She came to the office unexpectedly one day and overheard me on the phone with a client, pretending to be her. She was furious, threatened to report Michael and me to the authorities. "Is that why you arranged the weekend at the cabin?" I asked. "To contain the situation?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "Michael said he just wanted to explain everything to Sarah, make her understand that no one was really getting hurt. It was just creative marketing. But then, James found out she knew. And he panicked." According to Rebecca, James had convinced Michael that they needed to silence Sarah permanently. The plan had been to stage an accidental drowning during the weekend at the cabin. "But Michael couldn't go through with it," Rebecca insisted. "He loves his sister." When James pressured him, Michael threatened to go to the authorities himself. If Rebecca was telling the truth, this explained the argument Sarah overheard. But it still didn't explain who attacked her or where she had been for 8 days. We brought Michael in for questioning. Initially, he maintained his innocence, but when presented with Rebecca's statement and the financial evidence, his carefully constructed facade crumbled. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said, his voice barely audible. "The business was failing. We took some shortcuts. When Sarah found out, I thought I could reason with her." He looked up, his eyes haunted. "But James said she would ruin everything. He said he'd take care of it." "How?" I pressed. "James left for Chicago the morning after Sarah disappeared." Michael's expression changed, confusion mixed with dawning horror. "No, that's not right. James postponed his flight. He said he'd handle Sarah, then catch a later flight to Chicago. This was new information. We immediately checked flight manifests and discovered Michael was right. James had been booked on a 6 a.m. flight Sunday morning but had changed to a 4 p.m. departure, instead giving him plenty of time to handle Sarah. But hotel security footage confirmed James checking in at the Chicago hotel by 6 p.m. Sunday. Even allowing for the flight and transit time, the timeline was extremely tight for him to have taken Sarah to another cabin, struggled with her on a boat, and still made it to Chicago by evening. Unless... "The man at the Chicago hotel," I said suddenly, reviewing the security footage again. "We never actually see his face clearly. Always angled away from the camera, wearing a hat." Rivera caught my implication immediately. "You think someone checked in as James, creating an alibi? But who?" The answer came when we expanded our investigation to include David Winters. The grieving widower had presented himself as a retired school principal with no connection to his son's business, but finance records told a different story. David had invested heavily in Blackwood Winters, using money from Eleanor's life insurance money that would now be lost if the firm collapsed. More significantly, David had a cabin of his own on Pinewood Lake Knot, the family cabin where the weekend gathering took place, but a smaller property on the opposite shore that he'd purchased secretly 2 years earlier. When we searched this second cabin, we found evidence that someone had been kept there recently, Food wrappers, makeshift restraints, and most damning of all, fibers matching Sarah's pajamas. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when we compared DNA from the man in the photograph with Eleanor, one partially burned in the fireplace stove David's DNA. There was no match. The man in the photo, looking intimately at Eleanor, shared DNA markers with Sarah that David did not. The truth suddenly became clear. David was not Sarah's biological father, a fact she must have discovered in those family letters. The man in the photo was her real father, and this revelation threatened not only David's identity, but potentially his claim to Eleanor's estate, which had funded his investment in the failing firm. When we returned to the hospital to speak with Sarah again, her room was empty. She had checked herself out against medical advice just hours earlier. Surveillance footage showed her leaving with David. We issued an APB for both of them immediately. They were found 3 days later at a remote airstrip near the Canadian border, attempting to charter a private plane. Sarah was not being held against her will. She was a willing participant in the escape attempt. The full confession came during separate interrogations. Sarah admitted she had never been attacked or held captive. After overhearing Michael and James discussing the financial fraud, she had confronted David with what she'd learned about her parentage from the letters. Instead of denying it, David had proposed a plan: stage her disappearance, frame James for it, and use the ensuing investigation to expose the financial crimes at Blackwood Winters. "I just wanted the truth to come out," Sarah explained, though her eyes couldn't meet mine. "About the fraud, about my real father, all of it. I never thought it would go this far." David's motivation was darker. With Blackwood Winters under investigation, he could distance himself from the failing firm before his involvement became public. And by establishing Sarah as a victim rather than a whistleblower, he maintained control of the narrative and his relationship with her. "She's still my daughter," he insisted during questioning. "Blood or not, I raised her. I couldn't lose her too. Not after Eleanor. The blood in the kitchen?" Sarah had cut her hand deliberately, leaving evidence of a struggle. The security system log? David had entered the cabin in the middle of the night to help Sarah stage her disappearance. The footprints leading to the lake? A calculated misdirection. As for James checking into the Chicago hotel, it had indeed been James himself. He had flown to Chicago as planned, completely unaware that he was being set up as a scapegoat. The tight timeline worked because there was no attack, no second cabin, no struggle on a boat. Sarah had willingly disappeared with David's help, hiding at his secret cabin until they decided it was time for her dramatic escape from her non-existent captivity. What began as a mysterious vanishing had revealed itself as something far more mundane yet equally disturbing: a web of financial fraud, family secrets, and a father-daughter conspiracy motivated by a twisted combination of revenge, self-preservation, and emotional manipulation. In the end, 4 people faced charges: Michael and James for financial crimes related to Blackwood Winters, Rebecca for fraud and impersonation, and David for obstruction of justice and filing a false police report. Sarah, positioned as both victim and perpetrator, received immunity in exchange for testifying against the others. But the question that haunts me to this day isn't about who did what or why. It's about the nature of truth itself. For 8 days, I searched desperately for a woman who didn't need to be found. I analyzed evidence that had been deliberately planted to mislead me. I interviewed witnesses who were lying not just to me, but in some cases, to themselves. In the Winters case, the mystery wasn't that a woman had vanished without a trace. The real mystery was how an entire family could construct a reality of their own making a reality, where financial crimes were just creative marketing, where paternity could be claimed through years of presence rather than biology, and where the truth was whatever they needed it to be at any given moment. How well do you really know the people closest to you? And what truths might they be hiding, not just from you, but from themselves? The aftermath. The Pinewood Lake case resulted in convictions for all 4 defendants. Michael and James received 10-year sentences for securities fraud and financial crimes. Rebecca was sentenced to 5 years for fraud and impersonation. David, despite his advanced age, was given 3 years for obstruction of justice and filing false reports. Sarah Winters, granted immunity for her testimony, moved away from Minnesota shortly after the trials concluded. Last I heard, she had changed her name and was teaching at an elementary school somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. She never responded to my attempts to contact her for follow-up questions. The cabin on Pinewood Lake was sold, the proceeds used partly to compensate the victims of Blackwood Winters' financial schemes. As for me, the case changed how I approach investigations. I no longer trust surface appearances or accept witness statements at face value, not because everyone lies, but because everyone constructs their own version of reality, shaped by their desires, fears, and the stories they tell themselves. Sometimes, the greatest deceptions aren't those we perpetrate on others, but those we perpetrate on ourselves. The moral lesson: what can we learn from the strange case of Sarah Winters and the mystery of Pinewood Lake? Perhaps the most profound lesson is how easily truth can be manipulated, not just by lying to others, but by constructing elaborate narratives that we ourselves begin to believe. Each person in this case acted based on what they thought was justified. Michael believed bending financial rules was acceptable to save his business. David convinced himself that protecting his relationship with Sarah justified their elaborate deception. Sarah believed exposing the truth about the firm and her parentage warranted the massive resources devoted to searching for her. In the age of carefully curated social media presences and alternative facts, we all participate in crafting versions of reality that suit our needs. Most of us don't go to the extreme seen in this case, but we all selectively emphasize certain truths while minimizing others. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: truth is not just about facts, it's about integrity. It's about the courage to face reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. The Winters family created a house of cards built on deception, and like all such structures, it eventually collapsed, causing far more damage than if they had simply faced the truth from the beginning. I often wonder, what would you do if faced with a painful truth? Would you confront it directly, or would you construct an alternative reality that's easier to live with? The choices we make in these moments reveal our character more than any words ever could. Closing thoughts and call to action. Before I wrap up this case, I want to ask you to put yourself in Sarah's position for a moment. Discovering your entire family history might be based on a lie. Learning that your brother's business is engaged in fraud. Finding yourself pulled between loyalty to family and ethical obligations to the truth. What would you have done? Would you have gone to the authorities immediately? Confronted your family privately? Or perhaps, like Sarah, constructed an elaborate deception that ultimately satisfied no one and hurt many? These aren't abstract ethical questions. They're the kinds of moral crossroads many of us will face in our lives, though perhaps in less dramatic circumstances. The time to decide what kind of person you are is before you face such a moment, not during it. If you found this case interesting or thought-provoking, please consider sharing it with friends and family. Not just for the entertainment value, but as a starting point for important conversations about truth, ethics, and the stories we tell ourselves. And if you'd like to hear more cold cases from my files, subscribe to the Shernan YouTube channel and hit the like button. Each case offers not just a mystery to be solved, but insights into the complexities of human nature and the choices we make when we think no one is watching. Until next time, this is Detective Shernan, reminding you that in the end, the most important case you'll ever solve is understanding yourself. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of human behavior. Stay safe, stay honest, and remember the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how deep you try to bury it.